Welcome to GardenDC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This week on the GardenDC podcast, we're joined by Mark Highland. He is the president and founder of The Organic Mechanic. He's also the author of Practical Organic Gardening, the No-Nonsense Guide to Growing Naturally. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So for our listeners, Mark, can you describe where you're located in the Mid-Atlantic and maybe a little bit about your own garden while we're at it?
Sure. Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, so that's southeast Pennsylvania, and lived here for a while now. My garden in the backyard is full of lots of containerized plants, and then some veggie garden beds and some things in the ground, of course, but still renting, looking for that perfect house. So we probably have 400 plants in containers. So I use a lot of potting soil.
And that will be one of the topics we discuss in a little bit, because we are definitely going to talk about all things soil health and maybe some of the new research coming down the pike and some of the basics about the differences between garden soil, potting soil, and that sort of thing. How did you get into gardening, Mark? Were you born with a green thumb, and are you native to the Mid-Atlantic? Is another thing I think our listeners would like to know.
Sure. So I was gardening with my grandmother, when I was a little kid, and I remember that I had the job of, because I was tall as a little kid, because I'm 6'3". So my job was to take the bucket and dunk it in the manure water, because my grandmother, there was a farm right next door, and they had cows and pigs and chickens and blah, blah, blah. So the cow manure water, I would get a big bucket of it, and then I'd go down the rows, and I would dump a little bit of this manure water onto the rows for my grandmother, onto her eggplants, onto her asparagus bed, everything. And then, after being a kid and gardening, I didn't do much until college. And I was actually going to school to be, I was in the art field. I was a glass blower. And I just decided that I didn't want to be an artist for the rest of my life, even though I'm still an artist, just not making a living on it. But so I found horticulture, and it was at the University of Florida. So I went to the University of Florida, got my degree in environmental horticulture. And environmental horticulture sounds like a very earth-friendly degree, and it is. But horticulture is also the number one user of pesticides and herbicides and things that are not great for our soils. And so I started this path of really looking at organics, and I knew I'd start my own company someday, and I didn't know exactly what it would be. And I worked on the West Coast. I worked for an organic farm, and I started a design build landscape firm. But then I came back to the East Coast and went to school at the Longwood graduate program, which is was a collaboration between Longwood Gardens and the University of Delaware. So I got my master's in public horticulture administration, technically, even though I also pretty much double majored with soil science, because I was doing a lot of work on compost and making really good compost also as part of my thesis, working at Longwood Gardens. So after that, I started the company basically in 2006. And so not a native of the Mid-Atlantic, because high school and college was Florida, and then I lived out in Oregon for a few years, but definitely Mid-Atlantic is home now. I've lived here the longest I've ever lived anywhere, and it's going on 2 decades. So.
And I think you are the only person so far on the podcast who can say they got their love of plants or start of gardening as the manure bucket boy.
Yep.
Is hauling manure buckets. So doesn't sound like it was the most pleasant job, but it sounds like it was something that made her garden super healthy.
Yeah, I can remember how big all the plants were. And granted, I was a kid, but hey, I was tall enough to reach that, manure water bucket. So
Hmm.
they were huge. Yeah, they were just always loaded with tomatoes and eggplant and peppers. And she had a big patch for pumpkins and winter squash and giant blueberry patch. And yeah, she was definitely farming for the household. And I was just the helper. But that was my first experience with gardening. And once I really discovered gardening, because until I made it to the University of Florida, yeah, I knew there were flowers and trees and, vegetables, but I didn't realize the exact abundance and diversity of species and what it all means for the ecological landscapes that we live in, that we create. So it was quite an eye opener, and I never looked back.
So it sounds like you grew up even with a farm existence and, you know, food growing around you, still a case of green blindness in a way.
Absolutely. Growing up, I could tell they were shrubs or trees, and
Hmm.
I think I knew what an oak tree was and a maple tree, some of the most basic things that kids learn in school. But beyond that, I didn't have a sense of it all. But man, you learn, 2,000 names to get through school on the East Coast, and then got to move to the West Coast and get a landscape contractor certificate. I had to learn 2,000 more plants. And then the Mid Atlantic, it's all different plants. And so, yeah, but I'm a plant person and I love learning. So it's been fun.
Hmm. And so now you're all about soils and soil health. Would you call lack of knowledge of the soil biome, would you call that brown blindness? What would be the term for that?
Yeah. You could probably pick and coin your own term for that there, Kathy. It certainly is a lack of knowledge around soil, and most everybody thinks it's dirt, and you can dig it up in your backyard and plant in it, and it's fine. Or if you go to the store, you're going to buy dirt, and we actually have one of our, all our T-shirts that we make have like a funny saying on the back, something to get people talking, and one of them says, "Dirt is a four-letter word," right? Just joking. And I always say in my talks, like, look, dirt is the stuff that's under your nails when you're done gardening for the day, or it's the stuff that you tracked in the house on your shoes, and mom or grandma or whoever would always scold you for that. That's dirt, right? But the soil itself is is a living thing. Uh, it can really influence the health of plants depending on how healthy the soil is. And that comes down to both physical properties and structure, but it's also the biological properties, the biological abundance and diversity within the soil. Because one teaspoon of good, healthy soil contains billions of organisms, mostly bacteria, but also fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and the entire soil biota. Right, I like to call it the underground safari, right, because it's wild down there, and they're doing a lot of things to help keep the soil healthy, to provide nutrients for plants. It's the soil biology that really makes things turn.
It's so fascinating to think about that tiny world that's in just that little teaspoon you described right there. So let's start with the makeup of the soil. So it's made up of air, water, and mineral, and then there's a living component, correct?
Yes, exactly. So that living component is the biology that's living on and eating the organic matter that's present in the soil, and they'll live attached to clay particles. In the soil, that mineral fraction that you talked about, that's the sand, silt, and clay. And you can test the physical properties of your soil, and it'll say that you have silty clay loam, or clay loam, or sandy soil. The ideal soil, as it talks about in all the books, is loam, which is right in the middle of the textural triangle. And essentially, loamy soils, they hold moisture, but they also drain very well. So there's not excess moisture, there's no soggy roots, but there's still good moisture retention, enough for the plants in between rain showers or waterings.
Hmm. And what we purchase in bags at a garden center near us. It's normally labeled garden soil. Is that loamy soil, or how would you know that that is the ideal mix for growing in?
That is a great question, Kathy, and we get that a lot. And again, the soil in our gardens, in our backyards, front yards, side yards, you name it, that's soil. So that's the sand, silt, and clay. There's water and airspace in there, and then organic matter. And that's very different than the bagged goods we get at the garden center. Now, certainly you can get a bag of topsoil at a garden center, and that's just like the stuff in your backyard, sand, silt, clay, a little bit of organic matter if you're lucky. But all the other products in the garden center, whether they're labeled potting soil, growing media, potting mix, garden soil, usually, 90%, 95% of the time, these products don't contain any soil whatsoever. It's kind of a misnomer, but they had to give it a name back in the
Mm-hmm.
when they were creating this stuff, and they landed on potting soil is the most universal, but it's a soil-less media. And potting soils usually contain peat moss, pine bark, perlite, which is the white stuff you see in the mix. Sometimes you see vermiculite, which is shiny, kind of looks like mica or fake gold. Um, and that's a pretty average mix. But at Organic Mechanics, we use a lot of other alternatives like coconut husk fiber or core. We use compost. We use worm castings. We use rice hulls instead of perlite in the mix. And yeah, the basics are the stuff we buy in the soils. The soils that we buy in the store. Usually, they're not great for just using in the backyard to patch a divot or that your dog dug up or something. In the backyard, you generally want topsoil, and then some kind of compost blend, soil amendment to amend that topsoil. And then for containers, you always want to make sure you're getting something that says potting soil or potting mix because it's made for containers.
And then there's a little bit of confusion too. So you're buying potting mix, and sometimes it will say potting soil, but you again want that light mix.
Mhm.
Um, that it'll sometimes be labeled as organic, and sometimes it just doesn't say anything at all. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the potting soil and all the gardening supply world, um, as of right now, it's not quite as regulated as organic food per se, right? So organic food, when you go to the store and you buy milk, bread, eggs, whatever, if it has the USDA organic seal on it, then you know that product came from a certified organic farm and was, grown or produced using all organic standards. And these are, USDA organic standards. But in the gardening input world, so soils and fertilizers and pest controls and those type of products, there's not a universal regulator, even though each of these products has to be registered in the state that it's sold in, and there is some oversight. They don't care if you write the word organic on the label because technically these products are usually made from organic materials, meaning something that was once alive. So peat moss, right? It's the buildup of plants over time on a peat bog. Pine bark, well, that's bark off a pine tree that's used for lumber, and the bark is collected and used quite extensively in the horticulture industry. If you've ever bought a plant at a garden center, guarantee you, especially on the East Coast, guarantee you there's pine bark as a significant portion of that mix. And, if you look at the West Coast, they use Douglas fir bark because Douglas fir is the dominant lumber species on the West Coast, right? And so, small differences, but, those are typical ingredients in potting soils.
Thanks for clearing that up. It's so confusing, Mark, because you're using organic in one way, and of course it's organic material, but then the consumer thinks of organic as being clean or pesticide free or chemical free. So those two different definitions of the term can be so confusing to the end user.
Absolutely, Kathy. And so one thing that gardeners can look for is what's called the OMRI logo. That's the Organic Materials Review Institute. I always say Omri for short. And it'll say it right on the package, Omri listed. And that means that the manufacturer has gone through this independent third party verification process that the product is truly organic and could be used on a certified organic farm. And for that, they test for heavy metals, pathogens, a whole bunch of tests that then you can clear. I mean, you have to certify that it's not produced using irradiation or sewage sludge or other types of things that are not allowed on organic farms. And so if you see the OMRI listing on a product, whether it's a soil amendment, fertilizer, a pest control, you still have to follow the label. The directions are very important. And if required, personal protective equipment, depending on what you're spraying. Because even some things that are organic, you shouldn't necessarily be inhaling. However, when you're using gardening products, anything that's OMRI listed, that you can use with confidence that it is pretty much organic in your garden.
And when you say inhaling, that means when you rip open that bag of potting mix or soil mix, you should wear a mask normally?
If it's really dry and dusty, especially if you have any kind of respiratory issues, you might want to consider it. But usually these mixes have a fair amount of moisture to them and they're not all that dusty. It's more of a like our staff wear masks when they're making the product in our warehouse, but that's because they're in the manufacturing facility and it is dusty at our place with all these raw ingredients. But at home, you should definitely wear gloves just because you never know and you don't want to get a cut on your hand and then get stuff in the cut. And, technically there is a particular bacteria that lives in peat moss. And, if you get it in a cut, it can be bad for you. And if you have heart conditions, you don't want any of that stuff in your bloodstream. So gloves are a good idea. But as far as inhaling it goes, everybody likes the nice smell of soil, and you breathe that in when you're in the forest, and it just smells refreshing and earthy. And a lot of potting soils can smell like that too. So, technically, there's also endorphins that are released in the human brain when we smell soil, and it's usually the bacterial products that are in soil. And this is like when you're digging in the soil in your garden,
Mm-hmm.
not as much in a potting soil per se, but in general, you don't need a mask. Really, it's just kind of if you have respiratory issues, and also if it's very bone dry, might be a good idea.
That's a good precaution to keep in mind, Mark. Yeah, if it's really dry or if it's been sitting, say, all winter in your garden shed or garage and you rip it open and just dust flies out, that you might want to put on a dust mask. But yeah, that scent you talked about, it can almost be addictive. I don't know about you, Mark. And maybe after working in it for years, you're like, eh. But that really good earthy scent is so beautiful, such a beautiful smell to work in and to be in. So I also wanted to talk a little bit for the very beginning gardener of a situation, say, where you buy a new home, could be newly manufactured home or an older home, and you go out to dig your first vegetable beds. What would be their first steps when they're assessing the yard? They know they have full sun in this spot, but what about the soil mix?
Sure. So I would, for purposes of this, exercise, I would assume, okay, there's probably turf grass there. And let's say like, oh yeah, I want to get rid of some of this turf grass and put in
Mm-hmm.
beds or in garden space. So the first thing I would do is remove a section of the turf. It doesn't have to be huge. It can just be one shovel kind of width around in a circle. But you want to remove that turf grass in the area you're going to plant anyway. And you can use that to patch some other area of turf grass if you got a rough spot somewhere. And then, but you only want to remove the turf grass. It's the grass roots are very likely only a couple inches deep, especially in new construction. Really, the point is you're getting down to the soil, what's underneath those roots, because that's usually sod that is rolled out after construction. And so you're removing that sod, that grass, and you're left with the soil underneath. And the first thing you want to do is dig yourself a small sample, and there's lots of soil testing companies that will test this for you. Every state has a land grant university with a cooperative extension service, and most of the universities still offer soil testing. And that will give you basic information like pH, what your nutrient content is in the soil. And there's other tests you can do and pay for, but the most basic test is usually around, 20 to 40 bucks, and it'll give you what nutrients in your soil and what your pH is, which is important. So it's a way to do a little investigative work to find out what your soil looks like. And if you're lucky, the contractor or builder did put topsoil back down after all the construction was complete. But depending on where you are and what the soil quality is, they may have and they may not have. And they may have put a smaller layer on than what was there originally before they cleared the site to build the house. So you may have a topsoil that is not a very deep layer, or you might have a soil layer where if they didn't pay close attention and they mixed all the subsoil and the topsoil when they were building and they put it all back in one layer, you may just have a very low organic matter content. And that soil test will tell you what the organic matter content is. And one key thing to note when you're sending in these tests, you want to, because there's a form, because obviously you got to send it in and you got to say what your sample is and what all that. You want to check the box for a garden soil sample. They just need to know that it's not potting soil, and there'll be a box for it. They'll be like, what area are you testing? And you could just write in even like my garden soil, turf grass, or my garden soil vegetable bed. And that gives them a little bit of info, but it just gives you a slightly different test result. There's a different test for soil in the ground than there is for potting soil to see what nutrients are present and available. So that's the first step. And if you have more time and energy, if you take it from 3 different areas that you're going to be planting, that'll give you a better representation of the whole area. But do take the tests from the same area that you're going to be planting in so that you're really looking just at that soil. Because I know it sounds crazy, but honestly, the soil from the backyard to the front yard can be very different, just based on how the contractor graded the soil and added the topsoil back after building. Um,
Mm.
and the longer your property has sat, perhaps the better the soil will be, especially if you have areas of undisturbed soil. You might have a really nice deep topsoil layer. But in the urban environment and in new home construction, it's usually not a very deep topsoil layer.
And it's usually pretty compact as well. So would you recommend they go out and rent a tiller or hand dig, or just leave it and work in it as it is?
Yeah, so that some of that will come down to where you are in the country. Um, because if you have really compacted clay and like clayey soils, and then it was compacted through construction, it's really hard to rebuild that physical structure so you have the air space required for plants to be healthy. And some of the listeners probably know that if you plant a tree somewhere on your property and it died, and you were like, well, the garden center said this tree would be okay in standing water, for example. And you try it again, you take it back to the nursery. Hey, my plant died. You get another plant and try it again. Sometimes the compaction can be too much and very difficult for, gardeners, homeowners to do by themselves. And if you're starting a new garden from scratch, if you're going to go in the ground, then and you don't have extremely compacted clay soils, I'd say, yeah, go for it. Get a tiller, till up that soil, but you need a whole lot of compost to till into the bed, which you can do in lifts, as they say. So let's say you remove the sod from an area, you're ready to prepare the bed. Number one, you should have got a soil test like we talked about, because that'll tell you what your nutrient content is. So you can find out if you're low in calcium or if you're low in something else. You can add it during this process right here and now. So you fire up the tiller, go ahead and till through that soil at least a couple times, then add a 2-inch layer or 3-inch layer of compost and any soil amendments that you need that you're lacking in, and then till that into the bed. And I would say that that should be the only time that you use the tiller on the soil, right when you're starting and building the raised bed from scratch in the ground. And that's because when we till a garden, we break up the soil. And if you till it too far and it turns fine like powder or flour, essentially you've loved that soil to death, and you've made it so there's not a whole lot of airspace or porosity.
Mm.
And so, you know, all the books used to say, like, oh, just till, it's fine, and till. But what farmers have learned firsthand over time is that it creates a hard pan where the tiller can't reach. And then you're essentially growing with not connected to the entire soil for water, is the main thing. And you have to water more often if you end up with this hard pan underneath, which will develop over time with tilling. And tilling also breaks up the soil networks of fungi primarily. And when fungi get started and really move into a soil and take up residence, it's like a superhighway down there for nutrients and water to be shunted back to plants for more growth. A lot of plants have a beneficial relationship with fungi that allows them to exchange nutrients, and the fungi can help find additional water and nutrients in the soil and feed it back to the plant. So when we till, we break that up, and then you got to start all over again. So it is highly beneficial to limit your tilling, but certainly when you're cracking into a new bed, you pretty much have to, in order to get the soil fluffed up a little bit, add some compost, and maybe, like, if you need calcium, you can put oyster shell flour in there. It's full of calcium, and every nutrient has a product that you can use to supply that. And most of the garden centers out there do have a very nice organic section now, where you can go to your local mom and pop type garden center, independent garden center, and find the nutrients, the soil amendments that you need.
Hmm. Excellent advice.
You can always build up, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to do all that work, or you're concerned about contamination of your soil, heavy metals or otherwise, then you can just build up, and you can build a raised bed out of just about anything. Certainly wood is the classic thing to build a raised bed out of, but you can build them out of cinder block. I've seen them built with just tree trunks from a tree got cut down, and somebody just built a raised bed with it. And essentially, you're going to fill that raised bed with soil, potting soil blend. And what we recommend for if you're building a raised bed from scratch, like let's say you build this 4x8 raised bed that's 12 inches tall, because even if you're just using basic pine wood, that's pretty standard sizes. But then you still have to fill this thing with 32 cubic feet of soil. And we recommend either a 50-50 mix of topsoil plus our planting mix compost blend, which is a blend of different composts, or a 75-25 mix if you want to go a little heavier on the compost to have extra organic matter for the microbes to eat. Because you can always add compost later, but having a little bit of topsoil in that raised bed makes a huge difference in water and nutrient holding capacity. It's really the clay that's in the topsoil that does this, but we always recommend you add in a little topsoil just because of the benefits to the plants.
And that does bring us to soil amendments and fertilizers. So, what is the difference between an amendment and a fertilizer? And then maybe let's talk about some of our favorite amendments.
So, I like to think of soil amendments and fertilizers as providing different functions in the soil. So, a fertilizer is very simple, it's plant food. So, all plants need nutrients to grow. If you look on a bag of fertilizer of any kind, it'll have three big numbers on it. And those are the nutrients that are used most by plants that they can't just get from the environment. And that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So that's the NPK of that fertilizer. And it'll say, 464 or whatever the numbers are. That's referring to the amount of fertilizer value that it has. And if you flip that bag of fertilizer over and look at it, there'll be a little box on the back that talks about the guaranteed analysis. And that's where you can see if it has anything else in the fertilizer. Maybe it has a little calcium. Maybe it has a little sulfur. Maybe it has a little magnesium. If it does, it'll be listed on the back. And so that's fertilizer, that's plant food. When we buy plants at a garden center, those plants have been fertilized practically every day of their life since they were little seedlings. So they're used to getting fertilizer.
Hmm.
And then if you keep the plant in a pot at home, well, it's got to get fertilizer from somewhere or it's going to stop growing. But when we plant plants in the ground, that plant can absorb nutrients from the surrounding soil because topsoil has a lot of nutrients naturally present. And so, fertilizers are for giving plants food so that they grow, it doesn't matter, leaves, fruits, flowers, the whole 9 yards. And a soil amendment, slightly different. I like to think of it as something you're adding to the soil to amend either the physical properties of the soil, or you're amending the organic matter content of the soil. So compost is a classic soil amendment because you're adding it to the soil to help increase the amount of airspace. You're adding it to the soil to add organic matter for the microbes to eat. You're also adding it because there is beneficial microorganisms present in most composts. And so you're adding it for all of those things. So is compost a fertilizer? Not really. Even though it has a lot of benefit for the soil, it's more of an amendment. And, again, it's kind of like that potting soil, potting mix thing. Some fertilizers are called soil amendments. But, bottom line, if it has numbers on the front of the bag, it's meant to be a fertilizer. And fertilizers are definitely usually more expensive than soil amendments. But, soil amendments on the East Coast would be compost or aged pine bark or pine fines. Certainly, all the old books would say, oh, you should add a bale of peat moss to that bed. I personally would encourage gardeners to consider compost over peat moss just because it is more sustainable. But that's my take on the difference between fertilizers and soil amendments.
And then there's the topic of soil conditioner. So sometimes you'll see bags labeled soil conditioner, and you're like, I use conditioner on my hair to smooth it out. But what am I doing with this on the soil?
Yeah, a little bit of that is just language, but it's very similar to a soil amendment. So a soil conditioner, I believe technically it's supposed to do something to the soil, and I'll give you an example. So gypsum is a soil amendment, or could be called a soil conditioner, because of the way it kind of opens up the soil structure. Meaning, these clay particles, if you look at it underneath an electron microscope, you can see the layers of material that make up the clay particle. And essentially, something like gypsum helps to open up those particles a little bit, so it can increase the cation exchange capacity, which is the ability of the soil to hold nutrients and make them available to plants. So adding something like gypsum, it adds a little bit of sulfur, and yes, it adds a little bit of other nutrients, but the main thing is it's helping that soil open up to hold more nutrients and water.
I'm glad you brought up cation exchange capacity, because
Yeah.
that is a concept I think for a lot of even experienced seasoned gardeners, it's like hard to hold in your brain. So maybe we can
Mhm.
go over that in a little more detail.
Sure.
So when we talk about soil having great cation exchange capacity, or sometimes referred to as CEC,
Mhm.
what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So I'd like to start very briefly going back to the periodic table that we all saw a long time ago. But the periodic table has all the elements listed on it, from hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium. And as an element, every particle has a charge to it. And that charge is either positive or negative. And if it's a positive charge, it's called a cation. And if it's a negative charge, it's called an anion. And so we say cation exchange capacity means the soil has the exchange capacity of these positively charged ions, or AKA nutrients. So, for example, calcium has a +2, potassium has a +1. And the ability of the soil to hang on to calcium and potassium and all the other positively charged nutrients in soil is directly related to the amount of cation exchange capacity, or CEC, as it'll say on the soil test, in your soil. And the things that affect this CEC the most are organic matter and clay content. So if you live, we're pretty close to the shore here, the beaches. And if you live near the beach, then you have sandy soil because you're in the coastal plain. And your cation exchange capacity would be lower than someone gardening in southeast Pennsylvania, anywhere in Maryland. Again, not near the beach or the actual shore near the Chesapeake, where it'd be sandier. But so cation exchange capacity is influenced by these things, and you really can't change your soil type. That's pretty difficult to do and very expensive, in my opinion, not worth it. What you can do to increase your cation exchange capacity is add compost. Compost is a wonderful way to increase CEC. There's other things you can add, like worm castings or biochar and other things that can increase that CEC. But when we increase it, we're increasing the ability of the soil to hold nutrients and provide them to the plant.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that little lesson. I feel like, okay, now it's going to stick in my brain, and I understand why we want to do that. And so you mentioned worm castings as one of the things that could increase the cation exchange, or the CEC, in the soil.
Yep.
Is that true of all animal manure products that we might add to our soils?
It is 100% true of any animal manure product. And you really want animal manures to be aged, ideally composted. But if it sits long enough, it might break down to the point where you can use it. Friends with rabbits, or friends with, et cetera, chickens, et cetera. You can use that stuff, but it does need to be broken down. You wouldn't want to plant in fresh animal manure because it could burn the plant roots. But yeah, absolutely. It does worm castings, or any of the usual suspects that are barnyard animals. The one manures you don't want to use in your garden or your compost pile is cat, dog, bird, any reptile. Those you do not want to put in. And the main reason being is that those animals are carnivores, and their manure can have E. coli present in it. And we don't want that stuff anywhere near our gardens. So you have to get rid of that the usual way. Yep.
And one of the products Organic Mechanics sells is insect frass fertilizer, and that's going to be maybe our vocabulary word of the episode. So frass is FRASS, and that would
Mm-hmm.
be the equivalent of manure or castings, but we're talking about, is it grasshoppers and crickets that you're using their frass for the fertilizer?
Yep, you got it. Yep, frass is the technical term, right? Just like if you're in the woods and you see a little something on the trail, and they call it scat. Mm-hmm. Yep, this is frass, and it is. So it's the waste product from crickets and mealworms. Insects that have another industry, right? Because they're people grow crickets for lizards, people grow mealworms for birds and other animals, but their waste is nutrient dense. It's got some great properties to it, and like our insect frass is a 3-2-2 fertilizer, so it's got a little punch to it. And then it also contains, and for the crickets, all their exoskeletons as they're molting, as they get bigger. So you get a whole bunch of very complex and diverse food sources for the fungi in the soil, and it can result in some excellent plant growth.
That sounds like it has a lot of calcium from that exoskeleton.
There is some calcium present as well. Yeah.
I have to confess, Mark, that you sent me a sample of that insect frass fertilizer, and I put it in my gazebo, which is open on the sides but has a roof, so it's protected from the rain. And some creature tore open that bag and ate it. I think it was a squirrel, but I was like, must be really yummy. But the rest I was able to use on my plants.
Right on. Yeah, it's something about critters and fertilizers. They love the smell of it. I guess they just think that they're going to find food in there. It's the same if you were to, apply some fish emulsion fertilizer to your vegetable garden. it smells very fishy for a few days, and then it goes away. But yeah, I've had animals come dig after that looking for the food that they think is there, even though it's technically fertilizer on all the plants, and that's why it smells like that.
So good precaution to know about, or that once you apply even, fresh animal manures of any kind, that you might be attracting some other animals to that.
For sure. I would say worm castings are the one exception because worm castings just smell nice and earthy. They don't have any kind of different or weird odor to them. And so, worm castings are a great amendment for houseplants because, hey, every houseplant needs a little boost every now and then, and nobody wants to use an organic fish emulsion in the house. So, worm castings can be good for that. And worm castings you could plant in immediately right out of the worm. Whereas a lot of the other manures, you need a composting time period. But yeah, castings, they make a great amendment.
I like that, right out of the worm.
Yep.
That's a good selling point for that. And good point about not using them on houseplants, the fish emulsion and others, because I have had friends do that, and yeah, not good for a couple days
Great.
inside your home. So our next soil amendment that I wanted to talk about is biochar, and in your book you refer to it as a supercharger for soil productivity. So how
Mhm.
can you define biochar for our listeners, and what makes it that supercharger?
Yeah, absolutely. So biochar itself is organic material that's been burned in the absence of oxygen. So this is either called pyrolysis. There's also it's produced using gasification, and those terms are important for the producers. But what biochar is essentially, it's for us for organic mechanics, it's wood that's burned in the absence of oxygen, and you burn the wood chip until all of the flammable materials are gone, and the only thing you have left is the pure carbon structure of the wood chip. And you can make it from just about anything, but in general, if we just talk wood chips for a minute, right? So that when you look at it, finished biochar, you can actually see a little bit of the wood grain left over. And if you're making it at home and you're using something like bamboo or perennial stems or whatever, when it's done perfectly, it still retains all of its structure until you break it up. So biochar itself, you can make it at home, but the most highest quality is stuff that's made in a facility where all they're doing is making biochar. So you heat the wood, you burn off all the flammable stuff, and then you have to stop the process, um, and essentially quench that material and get the fire out of it, right? And then you have biochar, and depending on the particle size that you started with, that'll influence its properties. How hot it was cooked at influences the properties, and how you quench it influences properties a little bit. But in general, if you go googling biochar, you'll find all kinds of people making it in their backyards. um, but for us, we had an intern try to make biochar at our facility all summer, and we found out we can't make it in the quantity that we need it for the price that we could get it finished. But biochar itself is a wonderful soil amendment. It has incredibly high cation exchange capacity. And so much so that raw biochar, the pure stuff, is used very successfully in stormwater management programs for green stormwater infrastructure around the country. And it's very effective at pulling things out of the water before that water goes into our watersheds. So that's pure biochar. And then in the garden, however, you don't want to put an amendment in the soil and have it pull all the nutrients out of the soil and then your plants turn yellow and don't look great. So
Mm.
you don't want to apply pure biochar to your soil. It needs to be inoculated, amended, and charged up. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, well, there are different biochar products on the market, and you want an amended or blended one to use right away. But if we use the example of the Organic Mechanics biochar blend, we mix it with compost and worm castings. We put kelp meal, alfalfa meal, zeolite, azomite, and bone char in there. And the reason why we put all those fertilizers in, as well as the soil amendments together, we're charging up the cation exchange sites on the biochar so that it's full of nutrients when it goes into the soil and it doesn't suck the nutrients out of your soil. And when biochar goes into the soil, so many wonderful things happen, and this has been proven over and over again in the scientific literature that it helps hold moisture. It helps with moisture holding capacity. It helps with nutrient holding capacity. It's a home for beneficial microbes, and it also allows a plant to resist stress better. And it doesn't matter if that's a drought stress or insect or pathogen stress. It can help the plant resist the stress better. And when I say it's a home for beneficial biology, if you look at a piece of biochar underneath an electron microscope, it is so porous. You can see all these little holes in it. And it basically, the biology loves to set up shop in chunks of biochar. And that doesn't matter if it's any of those ones I mentioned previously, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, the nematodes, they'll be all over it. And then over time, the biochar starts to complex into the soil. It'll be near a clay particle and it'll start to build up over time. And biochar is a lifetime amendment. Biochar is based on the terra preta soils of the Amazon. And USDA scientists have been down there doing work, as well as many other people, and have proven that these soils, by carbon dating, that they're 2,000 years old. This carbon is still there. It was put in place because they figured out, hey, if we add this carbon to the soil, we get better vegetable growth. Let's keep doing that. And so it's a lifetime amendment. Once you put it in the soil, you don't have to add it again. And it just keeps getting better with each passing year.
And for application in the home garden, would you recommend it for when you plant a shrub or tree, or would it even be useful in the vegetable garden?
So it's going to help any plant that you're putting in the ground. You get the most bang for your buck in the vegetable garden because you're harvesting things out of it each year. And you don't want 6 peppers to show up on that plant. You want to see 24 peppers, or if you normally get 24, you would rather have 3 or 4 dozen, right? Depending on what type of pepper. And so you get a huge boost in the vegetable garden. But I also recommend it for anybody that's doing their annuals out front, because hey, don't you want those annuals to look gorgeous all summer? And by adding biochar, it can help with plant growth and health. We've even done nutrient testing of plants to show that the compounds go up in plants that are grown in biochar. And so, yeah, you can use it anywhere. People are using it on trees, shrubs. People are using it in tree pits in cities to help those trees live longer, healthier lives. But the big benefit is you put it in once and it's there for life. So if you put it in for a new tree, hey, you're good. You don't have to add it again. But it can be used on any plant at any stage.
And I love that it's one time and set it and forget it. So
Mm-hmm.
perfect. And especially if you really have, poor soils to begin with, that sounds like a great place to start with biochar mixes.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is that it's definitely still a buyer beware in product, because there's a lot of people selling biochar and they are all different. And because it's the carbon content that you're really looking for in biochar. It's like I said, like wood chips burned. And so if they burn it too far, like places that are burning wood chip for energy, they're going to burn a lot of that carbon up, and it might only be 10% carbon left, and mostly ash. And yes, it has value, but it's not necessarily the biochar you're looking for. And also, some of them, if they have high ash content, they're going to have a high pH. And we do not want high pHs in our soils because it affects plant growth and nutrient availability. So most biochar, you want to look for a biochar that has a pH of around 8 at most, quite honestly. But there are some that are for sale that are a lot higher than that.
So it's fascinating, Mark. So how can our listeners contact you and find out more?
Well, certainly our website, organicmechanicsoil.com. You can Google search organic mechanics potting soil, it'll come right up. And, on our website, we do have a learning center with lots of blog posts and videos about our products. And And from there, the contact us page, you can find my email and email us or call the office. You get me or Eric on the phone, and we'll talk through any kind of questions people have about ordering, etc. But there's lots of info on our website for sure. But in our social pages, right? Definitely, they can connect with us on Instagram and all that good stuff. So,
well, thank you, Mark. Any last thoughts on soil health in general?
Plant health begins with the soil quality. It is all about soil. If you don't have healthy soil, those plants are not going to do well. So it pays to invest a little time up front in researching your own soil before you plant in it, so you can try to have the healthiest, most abundant and productive garden ever. And it doesn't matter if it's vegetables or flowers or trees, and why you're gardening. It really pays to pay attention to the soil.
Well said. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Kathy.
Mountain mint plant profile. Mountain mint, Pycnanthemum species, is a perennial wildflower that blooms in midsummer and grows to about 3 feet high. It is native to the eastern United States and is hardy to zones 4 through 8. It is a pollinator magnet in the garden. The leaves of this plant smell like spearmint when lightly crushed. The tiny flowers are held above silvery bracts that make the plant look like it has been frosted or flocked. It is adaptable to various growing situations, from full sun to full shade. It thrives in both dry and moist conditions, and performs well in loamy, sandy, or clay soils. Mountain mint is a good choice for meadows and along woodland edges. As with most members of the mint family, mountain mint is deer and rabbit resistant. Mountain mint can spread aggressively via underground rhizomes, so give it room to grow, and place it next to other native plants that can keep it in check, such as Monarda and Rudbeckia. Mountain mint, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, the interns and I entered a few items into the Montgomery County Agricultural Fair, and we won 17 ribbons. Hooray! So it's a great experience to be able to grow things in your garden, in your community garden plot, submit them for judging, and then come home with some fun prizes. I very highly recommend doing that with your family. It's a great activity to do with kids or just by yourself. That prize-winning tomato is a great thing to share. So locally in the DC area, there's a few events I wanted to let you know about. Upcoming on Thursday, August 26th, is a summer soiree at the Common Good City Farm on V Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. That includes several activities such as a DIY flower crown station, a build your own ice cream sundae, and tours of the urban farm. So get in those last wonderful days of summer. And also happening locally on September 17th is the Art of Ikebana. It's a demonstration of Japanese flower arranging at the Hilton McLean in Tyson's Corner, McLean, Virginia. That's being hosted by the Ikebana International Chapter number 1 in Washington, D.C. So you'll want to purchase your tickets soon for that. Also going on locally is a family fall festival at Green Spring Gardens on Saturday, September 25th. So this annual family festival has activities such as classes for children and adults, a silent auction to benefit Green Spring Gardens, book sale, and a bake sale, as well as several vendors selling a large variety of plants and other items. So mark your calendars for that Saturday to support Green Spring Gardens and to have some garden fun. And finally, Saturday, October 2nd is the Fona Bulb Sale. This is a new event this year put on by the Friends of the National Arboretum at the U.S. National Arboretum. More details will be announced soon, but set aside space in your bulb garden, in your budget, to come and support the National Arboretum and attend this wonderful new event. And looking ahead into the future a bit, we have on October 21st through 23rd an illuminated celebration of fall at Ladue Topiary Gardens in Moncton, Maryland. You'll want to get your tickets online soon at laduegardens.com. And then Washington Gardener Magazine, we are hosting our Fall Garden Book Club meeting on Thursday, November 18th at 6:30 p.m. in the evening. This is a virtual book club meeting, so it will be on Zoom, and you'll need to register to get that Zoom link. We will be discussing The Revolutionary Genius of Plants by Stefano Mancuso. So this is a fascinating book on how plants communicate with each other. So check that book out of your local library or purchase it online or wherever you get your books, and then join us for that discussion on November 18th. Happy gardening! Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at washingtongardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.